Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 440, and this time I'm going to talk about this record by Mal Waldron, which came out on New Jazz, which is a sub-imprint of Prestige, in 1962. And what I have here is the 2024 Craft reissue, big, thick vinyl, all analog, extra chasm, all the bells and whistles. There are some sonic issues with this, unrelated to the technology, but I'll get to those later. Now, Mal Waldron was a musician's musician. He was somebody who cut his teeth on classical music and then jazz saxophone before becoming a Mingus acolyte. He'd switched relatively late to the piano. He'd modeled himself then on Bud Powell and the other giants of the bebop era before Charles Mingus leans on him and suggests that he needs to find his own voice and be less of a derivative musician. Having found his own voice, he then flourishes as a musician in the late 1950s and early 60s. He then suffers an overdose which sets him back significantly. It takes him a while to recover, but he does so. He moves to Europe, and eventually he becomes the very first musician to record on ECM. This record is from the early 1960s, before that damaging breakdown, but well after he'd begun to find his own feet. It's a fascinating record on which not everything works, but when it does come together, the result is some unforgettable music. Mal Waldron, Mal is short for Malcolm, was born in 1925 in New York City. His parents were immigrants from the Caribbean, and by the standards of black families in the 1920s and 1930s in America, he had a relatively middle-class upbringing. His parents much preferred classical music to jazz, and he was introduced to classical piano at the age of 7. By his own account, he learned classical music largely out of fear because if he didn't practice, he'd get his knuckles rapped. But in his early teens, around age 14, he becomes infatuated with jazz and he buys himself an alto saxophone and teaches himself to play to a professional level. After high school, he's drafted and he spends from 1943 to 1945 in the Army, and when he's discharged in 1945, he enrolls in Queens College in New York in the music program on the GI Bill. As a music student, he used every spare moment he had to catch jazz gigs on 52nd Street. As a performer on the alto sax, he toiled without recognition or success, eventually realizing he'd fall well short of the standards set by his idol, Charlie Parker. Given his impact as a piano player in the later 1950s, it's kind of remarkable, however, that he doesn't actually give up the alto sax until he's 25, around 1950. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the most exciting player on the Manhattan scene was probably Thelonious Monk. And Waldron really dug Monk, but he was selective in what he took. What he was interested in was Monk's modernism, his use of white space, of empty places in the music. He also hung around with some progressive young piano players who were like-minded, people like Herbie Nichols and Randy Weston. He sponged up ideas from them, and he also was one of the few who didn't reject the music of Cecil Taylor, a player he very much admired. His first recording date occurs for Hi-Lo Records in 1952 in a quartet led by the saxophonist Ike Quebec, but his first real foothold in the world of serious jazz occurs in 1954 when he's recruited into Charles Mingus's jazz workshop. And with Mingus, around whom the shoots of collective improvisation are starting to appear, he is on some superb records. Through Mingus, he meets the alto player Jackie McLean, and through McLean, he meets Prestige Records supremo Bob Weinstock, and he soon becomes Weinstock's first call sideman on piano. In 1957, he also forms his own quintet with Idris Suleiman and Gigi Grice. And with that quintet, in 1957, he makes Mal 1, the first of 8 records he'd make for Prestige and his sub-imprints. In the late 50s, he's also on more than 40 records as a sideman for Prestige, including 3 for Coltrane, 9 blowing sessions for the saxman Gene Ammons, and 7 with Jackie McLean. In the midst of this prolific period for Prestige, he also begins to work on a performance basis with Billie Holiday, and he ends up staying with her for a couple of years until the very end when she dies in 1959. He's on that record Lady in Satin, amongst others. Beyond his flexibility in musicianship, the other thing which Waldron really brings to the table is his writing. He was a prolific composer throughout his career. For instance, this whole record is composed by him, but he could also be relied upon to bring original music to other people's recording dates. He wrote a bunch of tracks for Gene Ammons, including all 4 tracks on Ammons' record Blue Jean. Coltrane also recorded quite a few tracks that Waldron composed for Prestige, including 3 of the 6 tracks on Coltrane's record with Paul Quinichette, Catton. In the years following Billie Holiday's death, Waldron moves increasingly into what you might call conscious or avant-garde musical circles. And in this vein, his most important associations are with Max Roach and Abbey Lincoln, and with a quintet led by Eric Dolphy, which featured Booker ERVIN on tenor sax. With Roach and Lincoln, the music was politically cutting edge. With Dolphy and Ervin, it was more experimental and out, I guess you would say. And in that vein, Waldron appears on those wonderful recordings made at the 5 Spot in July 1961. But just a few weeks before that, he had gone with Dolphy and Ervin into the studio to make this record. This record is made on the 27th of June, 1961 at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs. Esmond Edwards, that great pioneer for black recording executives, is the producer. Mal Waldron plays piano. Eric Dolphy plays alto sax and clarinet. Booker ERVIN's on tenor. Charlie Persip is on drums. Joe Benjamin's on bass. And Ron Carter is on not bass, but cello. The 2 horn players are, of course, Waldron's bandmates from Eric Dolphy's quintet. And Waldron has said in subsequent interviews that he wrote this whole record with Ervin and with Dolphy in mind, that the whole thing came to him when he was writing as a whole entity. I've mentioned that sonically there are some challenges with this record. I think it's really that the musical lineup challenges the engineer. Dolphy, who's always a powerful player, is playing the alto sax, he's playing the clarinet, and there's also a cello. And the higher range of these instruments and their assertive place in the mix, combined with Waldron's naturally kind of self-effacing and subtle style of playing, gives this record some dynamic challenges, let's just say. You may find yourself twiddling the volume knob at points when you're playing it. Now, I want to come back to the cello for a second. Its inclusion on here is one of the more remarked upon aspects of this record. I've spent, for whatever reason, a good amount of time in the last couple of years listening to jazz cello, partly because of my interest in the musician Harry Babison. Fred Katz also gives his cello strings a good chafing on some early Chico Hamilton LPs. Oscar Pettiford also had a crack at it. And I will say that I've listened to all that and come to the conclusion that the cello is not necessarily a friend to jazz. Now let me qualify that. Bowed, I think it works. It's got a nice chamber feel, and I think that's what Waldron is going for here. But plucked, it doesn't give you the same satisfying deep thump of a bass. Instead, what you get is, frankly, kind of a plinkety-plinkety-plink sound, which is not going to draw me back to the club. To be clear, I'm not criticizing Ron Carter, God forbid. I'm just saying I'm not wild about the cello experiment. Side 1 starts with Status Seeking, and this begins with a fiery Eric Dolphy solo. I felt a bit sorry for Booker ERVIN here because Dolphy in that kind of mood is a hard act to follow. I think this is also one of the tracks which reveals the limitation of the cello. On Duquility, however, that most elegant of creatures, an avant-garde ballad, I think the cello comes off a lot better. It's also an example of how the subtlety of Waldron's playing is such wonderful glue. 13 is a more upbeat number which kicks off with a quite out Dolphy solo and a muscular ERVIN follow-up. On We Did It, which is the last track on side 1, Dolphy is in absolutely electric form, but I have to say this is another track where I really struggle to find the place for the cello. But I will say that Charlie Persip's drum solo is rip-snorting. If I was lukewarm about side 1, side 2 is a revelation, beginning with Warm Canto, which is absolutely beautiful, and it features Dolphy's B-flat clarinet. The cello absolutely works, and once again, Waldron's magical piano is the glue. A++ on this track. Warp and Woof is a blues, which continues quite the switch up from the first side. The theme features some discordant strings, and then Waldron has just a charming solo using largely block chords, and ERVIN sounds very much in his element here. The final track, Fire Waltz, I think is a masterpiece. It has the whole band in alignment. It features Booker ERVIN's finest moments on the record, and pleasingly, you get to hear the whole thing reprised again a few weeks later on Dolphy's 5 Spot recordings. There are many different versions of Mal Waldron at different points in his catalog, but this record just might be the sweet spot. It contains far more ambition than most jazz records, and certainly far more ambition than the typical prestige blowing session, which this is not. It's intentional and self-consciously compositional. It's performed by its composer with musicians for whom the music was written, and using instruments, some of which are rarely used in a jazz context. While, as noted, it doesn't all work for my ears, that's okay. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. We're lucky that it's been well reissued at last, and the reason it's been so scarce in all these years is that the music is consistently fascinating. It will titillate your ears, and for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.